The afternoon sun was hot and heavy above the wide canyon. Dust drifted across the land, catching the golden light as the wind brushed against the tall grass. Miles rode his horse along the rocky ridge, guiding the animal carefully. The leather reins tight in his rough hands. He was a rancher who had spent most of his life under the open sky, working with cattle and living alone near the edge of the wild country. The land was everything he knew, its dangers, its quiet peace, and its endless beauty. But that day the land turned against him in a way he never expected. He had gone out early to find a stray calf that had wandered too close to the cliffs. The narrow trail wound between sharp rocks and loose soil. He could see the river far below, glimmering in the sun like a moving piece of glass. His horse shifted nervously, the animal's hooves slipping slightly on the edge. Miles whispered softly, trying to calm it, but the wind howled through the canyon and made the animal uneasy. Then it happened in a blink. The ground beneath them crumbled. A sharp sound of breaking rock filled the air. The horse reared, startled, and Miles felt his balance disappear. He tried to grab the saddle horn, but the cliff gave way faster than he could react. The world spun around him, the sky above, the earth below, and then there was only the sound of rushing wind. He hit the side of the cliff, rolled over loose rocks, and everything went dark. When he woke, he was lying on soft ground. The air smelled of damp earth and leaves. His body ached everywhere, and when he tried to move, a sharp pain shot through his leg. He looked up, and through the blur of his vision, he saw faces. Strange faces painted with natural colors, eyes dark and calm, watching him carefully. He blinked, unsure if he was dreaming. One of them, a tall man with long black hair tied behind his head, bent down and said something in a language Miles did not understand. The voices around him were quiet but full of concern. Someone placed a cool hand on his forehead. Another person pressed herbs against his injured leg, wrapping it with strips of animal skin. He tried to speak to ask where he was, but his voice came out weak. The tall man said something again, and a woman handed him a drink made of herbs. It tasted bitter, but it eased the fire in his throat. Then the world faded once more. For 2 days he drifted in and out of sleep. When he finally woke for longer, he saw that he was inside a hut made of branches and woven leaves. Smoke from a small fire curled toward an opening in the roof. The tall man sat nearby, carving a piece of wood. When he saw Miles move, he nodded slowly, his expression kind. The woman returned with a bowl of broth and helped him sit up. She didn't speak his language, but her gestures were gentle. Miles realized that these people were from a tribe deep in the forest, a tribe he had only heard of in stories. People in nearby towns said they lived far beyond the rivers and mountains, away from all contact, guarding their land from outsiders. Yet here they were, saving him, a stranger who had fallen into their world. He tried to thank them. He pointed to his heart and nodded. The tall man smiled slightly, understanding his meaning. Over the next few days, Miles began to learn small gestures they used to communicate. When he was thirsty, he touched his lips. When he wanted to express thanks, he placed his hand over his chest and bowed his head. They responded with quiet smiles. As the days passed, his body started to heal. His leg remained bound, but the swelling went down. The tribe members visited often. The children would peek through the hut's opening, curious about the man who came from the cliffs. The woman who cared for him brought new herbs every morning, grinding them carefully before applying them to his wounds. Sometimes she hummed soft tunes that made the forest outside feel peaceful, like a heartbeat of the land itself. One evening, as the sun fell low and golden light filled the forest, the tall man returned and sat beside Miles. He pointed toward the scar on Miles's arm, then to the horizon and said a word slowly, "Life." Miles nodded, understanding that the man was telling him he was lucky to still be alive. He smiled back and said softly, "Thank you." Over time, Miles began to understand more of their kindness. The tribe didn't treat him as a burden, but as someone under their care. They shared food with him, simple meals of roasted roots, wild berries, and fish caught from the nearby river. They taught him to use a crutch made from a carved branch so he could move around a little. The children laughed each time he tried to walk, cheering when he took more than a few steps. At night, the forest came alive with sounds, crickets, the whisper of wind through the leaves, and the distant cry of an owl. Lying on a bed of woven reeds, Miles often stared up at the stars through the open roof. He thought about his ranch, his horse, and how far away his world felt now. He didn't know if anyone would find him, or if he could ever return, but in that quiet, Surrounded by people who had saved his life without asking for anything, he began to feel a strange calm. One morning, he woke to find the woman tending a small fire outside. She motioned for him to come. His leg was stronger now, and he used his crutch to step carefully outside. The forest spread endlessly around him, alive with mist and sunlight. The tribe members moved about their morning tasks, some preparing food, others weaving or crafting tools. It was a simple life, but there was harmony in every movement, a rhythm that made the air feel sacred. The tall man approached and handed Miles a small carved pendant made of wood. It was shaped like a leaf with markings along the edge. He placed it in Miles's hand and said something that sounded like a blessing. Miles didn't know the words, but he could feel their meaning in the man's tone. He pressed the pendant to his heart in gratitude. That evening, as the fire burned bright and the tribe gathered around to share stories, Miles listened quietly. He couldn't understand their language, but he could feel the emotion in their voices. They laughed, clapped, and sang beneath the open sky. The woman smiled at him and offered him a piece of roasted breadfruit. For the first time since the fall, Miles felt a sense of belonging, a feeling he hadn't known in years of living alone on his ranch. Still, somewhere deep inside, he wondered what would come next. Would he stay here forever? Would he ever return to his world? As the fire crackled and shadows danced across the trees, those questions lingered in his mind. But for that night he allowed himself to rest. The stars above were bright and the forest whispered softly around him. For now he was alive, safe, and among people whose kindness had brought him back from the edge of death. Days turned into weeks in the forest. Miles could walk now without the crutch, though his legs still ached when he tried to move too fast. He had started helping the tribe with small tasks, carrying water from the stream, cutting branches for the fire, or helping to fix the fences made from woven vines that surrounded the camp. The tribe watched him with quiet amusement at first, but they grew fond of him as he learned their rhythm and moved with the same patience they did. The tall man, whom Miles now knew as Taryn, had become a kind of friend. They still could not speak many words to each other, but they had built a language made of gestures and expressions. When Miles helped repair the fishing traps by the river, Taryn would nod and clap him on the shoulder with a smile. When Miles tried to cook something and made a mess of it, Taryn would laugh, showing no judgment, only warmth. It was a bond born not of words, but of trust. The woman who had cared for him from the start was named Lyra. Miles learned her name when a child called to her one morning. She always carried calmness in her face, even when the world around them grew loud. Her hands were steady and sure, whether she was preparing herbs, tending to wounds, or weaving baskets. Miles often helped her gather leaves and roots from the forest. She showed him which plants could heal and which ones to avoid. Even without words, she taught him much about the balance of life in this hidden world. One day, when the tribe was preparing for the coming rain season, Miles followed Taryn up a small hill that overlooked the entire forest. From there he could see the river winding like a silver thread, and the mountain cliffs far in the distance, the same cliffs where he had fallen. His chest tightened as memories came back. He remembered the fall, the panic, the darkness. Then he looked at Taryn standing tall beside him, and realized that without these people, he would have been just another lost soul in the canyon. The wind blew softly, and Taryn spoke a few words pointing to the horizon. He then placed his hand on his heart and looked at Miles. It took Miles a moment, but he understood. Taryn was saying that when the rain season ended, they would guide him back to the outer lands. Miles nodded slowly. He had known this moment would come. He was grateful, but something inside him ached. The forest had become a home of sorts. That night, the tribe gathered for a small ceremony. They painted symbols on each other's arms and danced around the fire. Drums echoed through the forest and the stars shone brightly above. Miles sat near the fire, watching the colors move in the glow. Children laughed, elders sang, and for a while the world felt perfect. Lyra handed him a wooden bowl filled with fruit, smiling softly. He smiled back, feeling both joy and sadness at once. He knew that the closer the rains came, the closer his time here would end. The next few days were full of preparation. The tribe stored food, repaired huts, and built raised platforms to keep supplies dry. Miles helped as much as he could, learning how they worked together as one family. He admired their way of living. How every person had a role, how they never wasted anything, and how they respected the forest as if it were alive. It was a quiet wisdom that he had never seen before in his life outside. Sometimes at night he would sit by the river and think about his ranch. He wondered if anyone had gone looking for him or if the place was now silent, his cattle wandering free. He thought about how lonely his life had been before this accident, how he had spoken more to his horse than to any human. Now he sat here surrounded by people who barely spoke his language, yet he felt more connection than ever before. One morning, after a long night of rain, Miles stepped outside and saw the forest covered in mist. Drops of water sparkled on every leaf. The air was cool and clean. Lyra stood nearby, gathering fallen branches for the fire. When she saw him, she smiled and pointed to the sky where the clouds were breaking apart to show faint sunlight. He nodded. It felt like the world was waking up again. Later that day, Taryn approached him with 2 other men. They carried spears and had travel packs slung over their shoulders. Taryn gestured to the cliffs in the distance and said a few words. Miles understood they were ready to take him back. His heart pounded. He had waited for this day, but now he wasn't sure if he wanted it. Still, he knew he had to go. This was their land, not his. Before leaving, the tribe gathered around him. They offered him gifts, a woven blanket, a small pouch of dried herbs, and the carved pendant he had kept close since the first days. Lyra stepped forward last and placed a small stone in his hand. It was smooth and green, shaped naturally by the river. She said a single word he understood from their few shared moments. Peace. He nodded, his throat tight, unable to speak. They began the journey through the forest. The path was long and winding, filled with thick roots and high slopes. Miles moved slowly, his legs still weak, but the men stayed close to support him. The forest opened wider the farther they went, and soon he began to recognize the rocky ridges and canyons that marked the edge of the wildlands. It was strange to see them again after so many weeks. They looked different now, less like obstacles, more like old memories. By late afternoon, they reached a high point where he could see the open plains stretching far away. His ranch was out there somewhere, hidden beyond the hills. Taryn stopped and looked at him. He said something short, firm, and final. Miles understood. This was goodbye. He wanted to say more, to tell them how they had changed his life, but the words were lost between languages. So instead, he reached out and shook Taryn's hand, then placed his hand over his heart. Lyra's word echoed in his mind. Peace. Taryn and the others nodded and turned back toward the forest. Miles stood there alone, watching as their shapes disappeared into the trees. The forest grew quiet again, leaving only the sound of wind. After a while, he began walking toward the plains. Every step was heavy, but his heart felt full. It took him 2 days to reach familiar ground. When he finally saw his ranch, it looked smaller than he remembered. The fences leaned, the corral was empty, and dust covered everything. Yet when he opened the door to his small cabin, he smiled. He was home. He lit a fire and sat by it, holding the pendant in his hand. He thought of the tribe, their laughter, the firelight, and the songs that echoed in the forest. He realized that though he had returned to his old life, he was not the same man anymore. The days that followed were quiet. He repaired his fences, tended the cattle that had returned, and fixed the roof. Life slowly found its rhythm again. But sometimes, when the sun set, and the wind carried a certain scent from the trees, he would pause and look toward the far horizon. He could almost hear the drums in the distance, faint and steady like a heartbeat. One evening, months later, a group of travelers stopped by his ranch. They spoke of the forest beyond the cliffs and of strange symbols carved into the trees, signs of a hidden tribe. Miles listened quietly, smiling to himself. When they asked if he had ever seen such people, he only said, "They're good people. The best you'll ever meet." That night before he went to sleep, he took out the small green stone Lyra had given him. It glowed faintly in the firelight. He placed it on the table beside the pendant and whispered softly, "Peace to you all." Outside, the wind moved gently through the grass, carrying the sounds of the wild. Somewhere far beyond the hills and the deep forest, a fire might still be burning, and a tribe might be speaking softly about the man who fell from the sky and lived. And in his quiet heart, Miles knew that no matter where he was, a part of him would always belong there. With them, under the trees, where kindness and life had found him when he had fallen into the dark.